The German military leadership gathered in Berlin during the summer of 1939 with maps spread across large tables, tracing lines through Poland with their fingers. They had been planning this for months, working through countless details about how their forces would move, where they would strike, and how quickly they could achieve their objectives. The generals spoke confidently about their new methods of warfare, about speed and coordination, about striking so hard and so fast that the enemy would collapse before they could properly organize a defense. Hitler had given them their orders, and now they would execute them with precision. The German perspective on Poland was shaped by years of resentment and territorial ambition. They viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliation, a document that had stripped Germany of territory and pride after the First World War. The Polish Corridor, a strip of land that gave Poland access to the sea, had separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The city of Danzig, predominantly German-speaking, had been made a free city under League of Nations protection. German leaders spoke constantly about these injustices, about German populations living under Polish rule, about the need to reunify German lands. They framed their planned invasion not as aggression but as correction, as taking back what rightfully belonged to them. The propaganda machinery in Germany had spent years preparing the population for this moment. Newspapers printed stories about alleged Polish persecution of German minorities. Radio broadcasts described incidents along the border, some real but many exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The German people were told that Poland was unstable, aggressive, that it threatened German security. By the time the invasion was imminent, many Germans had been conditioned to see military action as defensive, even necessary. The regime understood that public support required careful cultivation, and they had invested heavily in shaping public perception. The military plan itself was revolutionary for its time. German strategists had developed a concept they called Blitzkrieg, though they didn't always use that exact term in their planning documents. The idea was to use tanks, motorized infantry, and aircraft in close coordination, punching through enemy lines at specific points and then racing deep into enemy territory. Traditional warfare had involved broad fronts moving slowly forward, but this new approach emphasized speed and disruption. If they could move fast enough, they could surround and isolate large portions of the Polish army before those forces could retreat or regroup. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would play a crucial role, bombing Polish airfields, supply lines, and command centers to create chaos and prevent coordinated resistance. The date was set for September 1, 1939, in the early morning hours before dawn. German forces had been massing along the border for weeks, positioned at multiple points from the Baltic coast in the north to Slovakia in the south. The troops waited in the darkness, engines idling, soldiers checking their equipment one final time. Officers synchronized their watches and reviewed their objectives. Everything had to happen simultaneously, a coordinated assault along hundreds of miles of frontier that would overwhelm Polish border defenses before they could send warnings or call for reinforcements. The Germans justified their attack with a staged incident at Gleiwitz, a German radio station near the Polish border. SS operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked the station, broadcasting a brief message in Polish, then left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish saboteurs. It was a transparent fabrication, but it served its propaganda purpose. Hitler could claim that Germany was responding to Polish aggression, that they had been attacked first. The German people heard about this incident and many believed it, accepting the narrative that their country was defending itself. When the attack began, it came with overwhelming force. Artillery opened fire, thousands of guns along the border launching shells toward Polish positions. Within minutes, German tanks began rolling forward, followed by trucks carrying infantry. The Polish border guards, outnumbered and outgunned, fought where they stood but could do little to slow the German advance. At the same time, German aircraft flew across the border, wave after wave of bombers and fighters heading toward Polish cities and military installations. The Polish Air Force, much smaller and equipped with older aircraft, had many of its planes destroyed on the ground in the first few hours. From the German perspective, the initial phase of the invasion proceeded better than they had hoped. Polish resistance at the border was quickly overcome at most points. The speed of the German advance surprised even some of their own commanders. Tank columns raced forward, sometimes advancing 30 or 40 miles in a single day, far faster than infantry had moved in the previous war. The German soldiers, many of them young men who had never seen combat, found themselves pushing deeper into Poland with surprisingly little opposition, at least in those first days. The Germans had divided their forces into two army groups, one attacking from the north through Pomerania and East Prussia, another attacking from the west and southwest through Silesia and Slovakia. The plan was for these two massive formations to converge, trapping the bulk of the Polish army in a giant encirclement. If successful, they could destroy Poland's ability to resist in a matter of weeks. The generals monitoring the campaign from their headquarters felt a growing confidence as reports came in of one success after another. The Luftwaffe's role in the campaign was central to German thinking. They had built their air force specifically for this kind of war, with dive bombers that could provide close support to advancing ground forces and bombers that could strike deep behind enemy lines. In the opening days, German aircraft attacked Warsaw and other Polish cities, though the Germans later claimed they were targeting only military objectives. Polish civilians experienced bombing for the first time, and the psychological impact was enormous. The sound of aircraft engines became associated with terror, with sudden destruction that could come without warning. German bomber crews flew multiple missions each day, returning to their bases to refuel and rearm before heading back into Polish airspace. From their perspective, they were performing a military function, destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war. They bombed bridges to prevent Polish forces from retreating or reinforcing threatened positions. They attacked railway stations and roads to disrupt Polish supply lines. They targeted communication facilities to prevent Polish commanders from coordinating their forces effectively. The air crews saw themselves as professionals executing a military strategy, and many felt proud of their effectiveness. The tank commanders leading the German advance experienced the invasion as a vindication of their tactical theories. For years, some military thinkers had argued that tanks should be concentrated in large formations and used for deep penetration rather than being dispersed among infantry units. Poland became the proving ground for these ideas. Panzer divisions raced forward, and when they encountered resistance, they would often bypass it rather than stopping to fight, leaving infantry units to deal with isolated pockets of Polish defenders. This created a fluid, chaotic battlefield where German spearheads were sometimes far ahead of the main body of their army. The German infantry, following behind the tanks, had a different experience. They marched long distances, sometimes 20 miles a day or more, trying to keep up with the rapid advance. They encountered Polish soldiers who had been cut off from their units and were fighting desperately. The infantry did much of the actual bitter fighting, clearing towns and villages, dealing with Polish forces that refused to surrender. For these foot soldiers, the invasion was exhausting, a relentless push forward with little time to rest. German commanders were particularly pleased with how their coordination between different branches of the military was functioning. In previous wars, armies had struggled to get infantry, artillery, and cavalry to work together effectively. Now they were managing to coordinate tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft in real time. When a tank column encountered a fortified Polish position, they could call in airstrikes or artillery support. When aircraft spotted concentrations of Polish troops, they could radio that information to ground commanders who would redirect their forces accordingly. This level of coordination required extensive radio communication and careful planning, and the Germans had invested heavily in both. The ordinary German soldiers advancing into Poland often saw the campaign through a lens shaped by their training and propaganda. They had been told they were superior, that their equipment was better, that their tactics were more advanced. When they defeated Polish units or captured Polish soldiers, this seemed to confirm what they had been taught. Many German soldiers wrote letters home describing their victories, expressing surprise at how quickly they were advancing. They spoke of Poland as if it were already defeated, as if the outcome had never really been in doubt. Polish resistance, from the German perspective, was brave but ultimately futile. Polish cavalry units, including some mounted troops, attacked German positions with courage but were cut down by machine gun fire. German soldiers later exaggerated these encounters, creating myths about Polish cavalry charging tanks with lances, stories that weren't true but that reinforced their sense of superiority. In reality, Polish forces fought effectively in many engagements, but they were simply overwhelmed by superior numbers and equipment. The Germans didn't need to fabricate Polish incompetence. They had achieved their victory through material advantage and strategic preparation. The Battle of the Bezura River, which occurred in mid-September, represented the largest Polish counterattack of the campaign. Polish forces managed to concentrate substantial numbers and struck at German positions along the river, temporarily disrupting the German advance. From the German perspective, this attack was unexpected and initially concerning. For several days, the outcome of this battle was uncertain, and German commanders had to redirect forces to contain and then destroy the Polish counteroffensive. When they ultimately prevailed, encircling and defeating the Polish forces involved, German military leaders saw it as proof that their system could respond effectively even when surprised. The Soviet invasion from the east on September 17 fundamentally changed the strategic situation, though Germans viewed this development with mixed feelings. They had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in August, secretly agreeing to divide Poland between them. When Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border, the Polish army suddenly faced enemies on two fronts. From the German perspective, this made their victory certain and immediate. Any remaining hope Poland might have had of prolonging resistance vanished when Soviet tanks began rolling westward. German soldiers encountered Soviet forces as both armies advanced deeper into Poland. The meeting was officially friendly, both sides having agreed to cooperate in Poland's destruction. German and Soviet officers met to coordinate the division of territory, drawing new boundary lines on maps. German troops pulled back from areas that had been assigned to Soviet control, and Soviet forces did the same where Germans were to occupy. For the German soldiers involved, this coordination with the Soviets was strange, even uncomfortable. Many Germans had been raised with anti-communist beliefs, yet now they were shaking hands with Soviet soldiers, exchanging supplies, even holding joint military parades in captured Polish cities. The Siege of Warsaw became the campaign's final major military operation from the German perspective. The Polish capital had held out while German forces swept around it, and now the Germans were determined to force its surrender. They subjected the city to intensive bombardment, both from artillery and from the air. German commanders justified this as necessary to break Polish resistance, arguing that the city's defenders were using civilian areas for military purposes. From inside their command posts, reviewing reports of shells fired and bombs dropped, the German officers saw this as simply the final phase of a military campaign that needed to be concluded. When Warsaw finally surrendered on September 27th, the Germans treated it as the end of the campaign. Polish resistance continued in scattered locations, and some Polish forces managed to escape to neighboring countries, but organized resistance on Polish soil had effectively ended. The entire campaign had lasted less than 5 weeks, far shorter than most German planners had anticipated. The speed of victory exceeded expectations and seemed to validate everything they had believed about their military superiority and their new methods of warfare. German soldiers occupying Poland after the fighting ended found themselves in a complex situation. They were occupiers in a hostile country where the population viewed them as invaders rather than liberators. The German military government that took control of occupied Poland was brutal from the beginning, though ordinary soldiers didn't always witness or understand the full scope of what was being done. They saw arrests of Polish leaders, intellectuals, and priests. They witnessed restrictions on Polish life, the closing of schools and universities, the confiscation of property. Many German soldiers accepted these measures as necessary for security, or simply didn't question the policies their government implemented. The Nazi leadership viewed Poland not just as conquered territory but as living space that would be reorganized for German benefit. They began implementing policies that would reshape Poland's demographics, planning to remove large portions of the Polish population and replace them with German settlers. The German military's role in this was sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. Soldiers participated in security operations that supported these policies, though the worst atrocities were often carried out by SS units and special police formations rather than regular army troops. The distinction mattered to some German soldiers who wanted to see themselves as professional military men rather than participants in crimes, though the regular army's hands were far from clean. German veterans of the Poland campaign carried away certain lessons that would shape their thinking in future campaigns. They believed they had discovered a formula for victory, a way of fighting that made traditional defensive warfare obsolete. The speed of their success in Poland gave them confidence, perhaps overconfidence, about what they could achieve. When they planned future invasions, they would reference Poland as proof that their methods worked, that they could defeat larger armies through superior tactics and coordination. This confidence would lead them into far more difficult campaigns, against enemies better prepared and equipped than Poland had been. The propaganda surrounding the victory in Poland was extensive. German newsreels showed triumphant soldiers, captured Polish equipment, and defeated Polish forces. The German people celebrated what they were told was a great victory, the righting of historical wrongs, the reunification of German lands. The speed of the victory made it seem almost easy, obscuring the reality that tens of thousands of German soldiers had been killed or wounded in the campaign. The propaganda emphasized German strength while minimizing German losses and completely ignoring the moral questions raised by the invasion. German military analysts studied the Poland campaign intensively after it ended, writing detailed reports about what had worked and what had needed improvement. They noted that supply lines had sometimes failed to keep up with advancing combat units. They identified communication problems and coordination failures. They recognized that Polish resistance had been more effective than expected in certain engagements. These were professional military assessments focused on tactical and operational questions, generally ignoring the larger strategic question of whether invading Poland had been wise or the moral question of whether it had been right. The officers who had planned and executed the invasion generally felt satisfied with their performance. They had achieved their objectives faster and with fewer casualties than predicted. They had tested new tactics and found them effective. They had demonstrated, in their view, that the German military was the most capable fighting force in Europe. This success bred a culture of confidence in the German military that would persist for years, even as they faced increasingly difficult challenges in longer and more costly campaigns. For the German soldiers who had participated, the invasion of Poland became a formative experience. Many of them would spend years at war, fighting in multiple countries across Europe and beyond. They would look back on Poland as their first campaign, the place where they learned what combat was really like. Some would remember it with pride, as a great victory achieved through their efforts. Others would remember it with more complicated feelings, as the beginning of a war that would ultimately end in Germany's total defeat. The strategic thinking behind the invasion reflected certain assumptions that would prove costly later. German planners believed they could achieve quick, decisive victories through superior tactics. They didn't plan for long wars of attrition because they didn't believe they needed to. Poland seemed to prove that their approach worked, that they could defeat opponents before those opponents could fully mobilize their resources. This led to a strategic blindness, an inability to recognize that not every enemy would collapse as quickly as Poland had, and that quick victories weren't always possible. The invasion also reflected the German military's willingness to serve a criminal regime. The officers and soldiers who invaded Poland were executing Hitler's orders, implementing policies designed by Nazi leadership. Many of them convinced themselves that they were simply soldiers doing their duty, that political questions were separate from military service. This separation was always an illusion, and their participation in the invasion made them complicit in what followed. The military success in Poland enabled the Nazi regime to continue its expansionist policies, leading to a wider war and greater atrocities. The aftermath of the Poland campaign saw Germany reorganizing its military for future operations. Units that had fought in Poland were refitted and retrained. Equipment that had proven inadequate was replaced or redesigned. The lessons learned were incorporated into tactical doctrine and training programs. The German military machine had been tested in combat and emerged stronger, more confident, and more dangerous. They began planning for the next phase of their expansion, looking westward toward France and the Low Countries. German society's response to the victory was generally positive. Most Germans had not wanted war, but now that it had come and been won so quickly, many felt relieved. The economic situation in Germany had been difficult, and military success promised better times ahead. The government's propaganda machine worked hard to maintain public support, emphasizing German strength and German rights while minimizing the costs and ignoring the suffering inflicted on others. For most Germans, Poland was a distant place where a quick victory had been achieved. Nothing more. The world's response to the invasion complicated Germany's strategic position. Britain and France had declared war on Germany after the invasion began, honoring their commitments to Poland. However, they had not launched any major offensive in the West while Germany was occupied in Poland. From the German perspective, this seemed to validate their strategy of quick, decisive campaigns. They believed they could defeat opponents one at a time before their enemies could effectively coordinate. The declaration of war by Britain and France was a problem, but one they thought they could manage through further military victories. The invasion of Poland marked a turning point in European history, though few Germans understood this at the time. They saw it as the beginning of Germany's return to greatness, the correction of past injustices, the assertion of German power. They didn't see it as the beginning of a catastrophe that would ultimately destroy their country, kill millions of their countrymen, and leave Germany divided and occupied. The confidence they felt after defeating Poland blinded them to the dangers ahead, to the enemies they were making, to the unsustainable nature of their aggressive expansion. Looking back from the German perspective years later, after everything that followed, the invasion of Poland would take on different meanings. Some would continue to see it as a military success, a well-executed campaign that demonstrated German military prowess. Others would see it as the beginning of a criminal enterprise, the first step in a war of aggression that violated international law and basic morality. Still others would see it as a strategic mistake, the beginning of a war that Germany could never really win, that would inevitably lead to Germany's destruction once its opponents fully mobilized their superior resources. The ordinary soldiers who marched into Poland in September 1939 were mostly young men who believed what they had been told about German rights and Polish provocations. They fought bravely, following orders, trusting their leaders. Many of them would not survive the war that followed. Of those who did survive, many would spend decades trying to understand what they had participated in, how the military success they had achieved in Poland had led to such catastrophe. The invasion of Poland was, from the German perspective, a great military victory. But it was a victory that led to greater defeats,